Today about the family of Oscar-winning actress Julia Roberts. Her half-sister Nancy Motes died on Sunday after an apparent drug overdose in her home in Los Angeles. The family released a statement today confirming the news, adding that the family is both shocked and devastated.
Julia Roberts' smile fooled the entire world. For more than 3 decades, that smile sold fairy tales. It made people believe in happy endings and convinced millions that some people are simply born under a lucky star. She became America's sweetheart, one of the richest, most successful, and most beloved actresses on the planet. But what if that smile was hiding a lifetime of pain? At 58, the story of Julia Roberts isn't the fairy tale we were sold. It's the story of a woman who became the face of happiness while carrying more heartbreak than most people could ever imagine. The hidden tragedy of Julia Roberts' childhood. Julia Fiona Roberts was born on October 28, 1967, in Smyrna, Georgia, the second daughter of Walter Grady Roberts and Betty Lou Bredemus. Both of her parents worked in the performing arts. Her father ran an acting school in Atlanta, alongside actress and playwright Coretta King. Her mother was an actress and acting coach who had studied the craft seriously before starting a family. That environment planted the idea of performance inside Julia before she could walk. But the home itself was complicated in ways that did not match the creative warmth that surrounded it. Her parents divorced when Julia was 4 years old. Betty Lou then married her second husband, Michael Motes, roughly 8 months later, a man who was 11 years her junior, and who sources close to the family later described as feared and despised by the children. Betty Lou herself later described that second marriage as the biggest mistake of her life, eventually filing for divorce, citing cruelty as the grounds after 11 years together. The second marriage also produced Julia's half-sister, Nancy, who would later play a devastating role in the family's most painful chapter. Julia has never spoken publicly about her stepfather. The silence itself carries weight. Then came the loss that rewired everything. Julia was 10 years old when her father, Walter Grady Roberts, died of throat cancer. He was 43 years old. The man who had run the acting school, who had given his children the idea that creative expression was something worth pursuing, was gone before Julia had finished elementary school. Losing a parent at that age leaves a specific kind of mark, one that does not announce itself loudly, but shapes quietly underneath the surface for decades. When Julia Roberts became America's sweetheart, by the late 1980s, Julia Roberts was becoming impossible to ignore. She appeared in Mystic Pizza in 1988 and Steel Magnolias in 1989, and both films showed audiences something they had not quite seen before. A quality of attention in her eyes that made every person watching feel like they were being seen rather than watched. She was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for Steel Magnolias before she had turned 23 years old. Then came Pretty Woman in 1990, and everything changed at once. The romantic comedy about a Hollywood businessman and the street worker he hires became the highest-grossing film of that year, pulling in over $460 million globally on a budget of $14 million. Julia Roberts became the most recognizable actress on the planet within the span of a single summer. Producers and studios began calling constantly. Magazines put her on every cover. The public fell in love with her smile, and Hollywood fell in love with what that smile could do to a box office. The roles that followed cemented what Pretty Woman had started. My Best Friend's Wedding in 1997, Notting Hill in 1999, Runaway Bride in 1999. Each film connected with audiences in the same specific way, not because the characters were identical, but because Roberts brought the same quality of warmth to all of them, a genuine investment in the emotional truth of every scene that audiences recognized, even if they could not articulate exactly what they were responding to. What the public did not see during that ascent was what was happening in her personal life. Fame had arrived fast, and the attention it brought with it was not always comfortable. Roberts was navigating new relationships, new pressures, and a public profile that examined everything she did with a closeness that left very little room for normal human error. The wedding that ended before it began. In 1990, Julia Roberts and actor Kiefer Sutherland became engaged. They were both young, both famous, and to every magazine and entertainment program covering them, they looked like the golden couple of early 90s Hollywood. 3 days before the scheduled wedding date, Sutherland called it off. The humiliation was both personal and spectacularly public. The wedding had already generated enormous media coverage. Guests had been invited. Arrangements had been made. And then the whole thing collapsed 3 days before it was supposed to happen, with the entire entertainment industry watching. Roberts later described the period that followed as one of the loneliest of her life. The person she had trusted completely had stepped away at the last possible moment, and she had to process that grief in front of cameras that were already waiting for her reaction. She eventually found something real. In 2002, she married cinematographer Nancy Motes, a man she had met on a film set who had no interest in performing for the cameras that followed her everywhere. The relationship that emerged was private, grounded, and deliberately kept outside the entertainment machine that had consumed her earlier romantic life. The two now have 3 children together, twins Hazel and Phineas, born in 2004, and son Henry, born in 2007. But the stability of her marriage did not protect her from what was coming in the years ahead. The accusation that shook Julia Roberts to February of 2014 was the month that broke something in Julia Roberts in a way that no amount of professional success could address. Her half-sister Nancy Motes was found dead in Los Angeles on February 9th. She was 37 years old. The cause of death was later ruled a substance overdose, and she had left behind a note. Nancy and Julia shared the same mother, Betty Lou, but had different fathers. Nancy had been working as a production assistant on the television series Glee and was engaged to be married. She had struggled with the weight of being Julia Roberts' half-sister in an industry where that connection was mentioned constantly without ever translating into real opportunity. The relationship between the two women had been complicated and strained for years. The note made it worse. Nancy wrote that her mother and her famous siblings would receive nothing from her death except the memory that they were the ones who had driven her into the deepest depression she had ever experienced. She named Julia specifically. She blamed the famous family for her substance problem. What makes that accusation so painful to examine at any distance is the specificity of it. Nancy was not anonymous in her anger. She was not vague about who she held responsible. She named the person whose face was on the poster and who had, in her view, existed in the same family without truly making her feel like she belonged to it. Whether that perception was fair or accurate, or shaped by the particular distortions that addiction produces in a person's understanding of their relationships, is impossible to determine cleanly from the outside. What is certain is that those words existed in writing, and Julia Roberts had to read them, and then she had to find a way to keep moving. 20 days after her sister's death, Julia Roberts sat down with the Wall Street Journal for an interview that had already been scheduled. Journalists described watching her face tighten and her eyes fill as she tried to find words for something that had no adequate language around it. What she managed to say was, "It is just heartbreak. It has only been 20 days. There are no words to explain what any of us have been through. It is hour by hour some days, but you just keep looking ahead." She leaned on her mother during that period. Betty Lou had been living with Julia and Danny and the 3 children since Nancy's death, the family pulling inward around the shared weight of loss. A source close to the family at the time described them as clinging to each other like people who were shipwrecked. The loss that followed the heartbreak. Julia Roberts had barely found a way to breathe through the loss of her half-sister when 2015 took something else. In February 2013, Betty Lou Bredemus had been diagnosed with lung cancer. The discovery came in the same stretch of time that Nancy Motes was struggling, a period when the family was already operating under significant emotional strain. Betty Lou moved in with Julia and her family in Malibu, where she spent her final months surrounded by her daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren. The choice to bring her mother into the house rather than into a facility was a deliberate one, shaped by the same instinct for closeness that had defined how the family responded to Nancy's death. On February 19, 2015, exactly 5 days before the Academy Awards ceremony that year, Betty Lou Bredemus died at the age of 80. Julia did not attend the Oscars that year. She could not. Losing a parent 12 months after losing a sibling in a self-injury that blamed the family by name created a specific and compounded weight that even people experienced with grief rarely have to carry. The two losses together formed something larger than either one alone. They came with questions that had no answers, with grief that could not be tidied or resolved or made to fit inside the ordinary framework of mourning. In an Instagram post sometime after her mother's birthday, Julia shared a photograph of herself wearing a bracelet engraved with the single word Betty. The hidden cost of Hollywood's biggest smile. Julia Roberts is one of only a handful of women in Hollywood history who held the title of highest-paid actress in the world. In 2000, the year she won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Erin Brockovich, she was earning $20 million per film. That figure made her the first woman in Hollywood history to command that salary. The recognition was not simply financial. It was a marker of how completely she had changed what was possible for women in an industry that had historically structured itself around male earning power. The Oscar itself, which she received for playing real-life environmental activist Erin Brockovich, was earned through one of the most committed performances of her career. The role required her to shed the romantic comedy likability that had defined much of her early career and replace it with something more abrasive, more specific, and more real. Critics noted the completeness of the transformation. Audiences responded by making the film a commercial hit as well as a critical one, earning over $250 million globally. The years that followed showed a different Julia Roberts, taking different kinds of risks. Ocean's 11 in 2001, where she joined an ensemble of established male stars and held her own without competing for attention. Closer in 2004, where she played a character with real moral complexity that the Pretty Woman audience had never been asked to see from her. Duplicity in 2009, a sharp spy thriller that showed technical control over a different genre entirely. These were not the choices of someone coasting on a famous face. They were the choices of an actress who knew what she had built and wanted to see what it could hold. But the decade that followed the Oscar was more complicated than the one that preceded it. Films that were expected to perform enormously did not always live up to projections. The industry began to question publicly whether her box office value had declined, with trade publications running pieces on whether the Julia Roberts era was ending. She responded the way she always had, by choosing interesting work rather than safe work, and by resisting the pressure to chase the audience that had loved her at 30, the same way at 45. The real cost of the fame was not in any single professional outcome. It was in the accumulation of what fame required, what it took from her privacy, what made it impossible to process quietly, and what it failed to protect her from when the grief arrived in real and specific and named forms. The woman at 58, Julia Roberts, turned 58 on October 2025. She has been married to Nancy Motes for over 23 years. Her twins Hazel and Phineas are 21. Her son Henry is 17. The life she has built inside that family is deliberately ordinary in ways that the career never was. She lives in Malibu. She cooks. She reads. She has talked in interviews about finding peace in activities that require no performance whatsoever, the specific relief of being present somewhere that does not require the smile or the projection or the awareness of being watched. The grief she has carried is real and permanent. The father she lost at 10, the half-sister whose final message blamed her by name, the mother who left 14 months after the sister, after months of living inside the same house, sharing the same grief, before the cancer finished what it had started. Those losses do not stop belonging to a person because the cameras move on to something else. What has changed at 58 is the relationship to the weight of all of it. The early interviews about Nancy Motes were characterized by rawness, by the freshness of pain that had not yet had any time to organize itself into something livable. A decade and more later, the tone has shifted towards something quieter. The bracelet with her mother's name on it. The Instagram caption that offered nothing except the simple fact of missing her. That simplicity is not a suppression of grief. It is grief that has been lived with long enough to stop needing elaborate language to describe itself. The children who grew up watching their grandmother live in the same house through her final months carry that knowledge now too. Hazel, Phineas, and Henry were 10, 10, and 7 when Betty Lou died in 2015. They were old enough to understand that the woman in the house was sick and to feel the weight of watching a parent grieve. Julia Roberts has described her mother as the person she learned everything she knows about motherhood from. The woman who ran 3 children as a single parent without ever showing the strain. The woman who answered a question about managing multiple small children with the driest possible honesty. It is called daycare, honey. That wit, that groundedness, that refusal to dramatize what could simply be done is visible in the way Julia Roberts has talked about her own family in the years since her mother died. The inheritance was real, and missing it daily is real too. There is a specific reason why the phrase America's sweetheart attached itself to Julia Roberts and has never fully let go. It is not only the smile, although the smile is extraordinary in the specific way that some people carry their entire interior life in their face without intending to. It is that the smile has always coexisted visibly with something else. An awareness underneath the brightness. A quality of knowing that life involves difficulty and choosing to keep showing up anyway. The lightness was never simple. It was chosen. The tragedy of Julia Roberts at 58 is not a single event. It is not a scandal or a diagnosis or a public collapse. It is the accumulation of losses and betrayals and complicated relationships that the smile was always carrying alongside the warmth, invisible to the people watching the films and seeing only what the fame allowed them to see. She lost her father before she was old enough to understand what the loss would mean for the rest of her life. She survived a public humiliation that would have broken many people and built something genuinely private and stable in its place. She received a note that blamed her by name from a woman she could not save, and possibly did not fully know how to reach. She lost her mother the following year. She earned more money and more recognition than almost any woman in the history of the industry she works in, and none of that protection covered what the losses cost her. At 58, the full picture of Julia Roberts is not simple. It is not a fairy tale, and it is not a tragedy in the way tragedy gets packaged for entertainment. It is a life, complicated and real, and shaped by things that fame could not prevent, and that money could not fix, carrying forward with the same quality of attention in those eyes that stopped audiences in their tracks when she was 22 years old and just beginning. Julia Roberts gave the world unforgettable movies and one of Hollywood's most famous smiles. But behind that smile was a woman carrying unimaginable loss, a father gone too soon, a half-sister's devastating final words, and a mother lost just a year later. Her story isn't really about fame. It's about resilience, about smiling through heartbreak and finding the strength to keep moving forward. The woman the world saw and the woman she had to become were never quite the same. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more untold stories behind the stars.